Great. Thanks for that. And good morning, good afternoon, and good day to everyone. Thanks very much for joining us on our webinar today. My name is Anita Dorret, and I'm the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which is a collaborative platform to enable responsible investments by really connecting investors with civil society and impacted communities who've been impacted by business activities. So in that spirit of collaboration, I'm really very excited to have collaborated with Anti-Slavery International and Sheffield Hallam University in putting together this research and reports. But to tell us more about that, I'm actually going to hand off to one of my colleagues, Caroline Dale from the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice at Sheffield Hallam University. Caroline.
Thank you, Anita, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the launch of this vital research on respecting rights in renewable energy. My name is Caroline Dale from Sheffield Hallam University, and I have the pleasure of bringing you a couple of brief housekeeping notes before we dive in and discuss the research further. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded. The recording and the presentation slides will be shared with all registrants shortly after we have concluded the webinar. Second, while we are thrilled to have such robust attendance, this does mean that all attendees will be left on mute for the duration of the webinar. We will leave time following the panelist discussion for Q&A, so please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. We will not have the chat box open for the session, so please be sure to use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, with that out of the way, we can dive into the real meat of this research. I'm honored to pass this over to Dr. Victoria Teka of the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center, who so generously funded this vital research. Victoria?
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline, for that wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the launch event for the research project entitled Limiting Investment Exposure to Green Technology Linked to Uyghur Forced Labor. Many thanks to my colleagues at Anti-Slavery International, at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and Sheffield Hallam University for inviting me to briefly speak to you today. So as Caroline said, I'm Dr. Victoria Teka. I'm a Policy Impact Manager at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center, or Modern Slavery PEC for short, which is based in the UK. And the PEC is extremely proud to have funded this research. You'll hear from the research team and from my fellow speakers today about why this work has been and will continue to be so important. And this will include a discussion of what we know is happening in the Uyghur region, how the situation there necessitates a different response to both the existence of and the risk of continued forced labor in the region than the way that we tend to address labor exploitation in other contexts. You'll hear about the challenges that investors and policymakers face when trying to navigate and address forced labor in this region, as well as what they can do as they seek to champion a truly just transition away from fossil fuels. You'll also hear about why working with people in and from the Uyghur region is a fundamental and necessary component of generating both evidence and effective solutions. Before I hand over to those who led on this research, however, I'd like to give you a bit of context as to why the Modern Slavery PEC chose to fund research looking at the intersections between modern slavery on the one hand and climate change on the other. So even though for people who are directly affected by these phenomena, it isn't new knowledge that forced labor and climate change are so inherently intertwined, it's still a relatively nascent area of formal study. But there's now a growing body of research that's identifying evidence of the cyclical relationship between these two issues, showing that social harm and environmental harm are increasingly inseparable and more effectively addressed when they're addressed together. We know that activities associated with biodiversity loss, with environmental damage, or that otherwise contribute to climate change are known to involve forced labor in some contexts. So, for example, in overfishing or in deforestation. We also know that extreme climate events like drought and floods have devastating short and long-term consequences for people's livelihoods and are drivers of displacement and forced migration, which increase people's vulnerabilities to modern slavery. And thirdly, and key to our discussion today, we know that policies and practices that are enacted to respond to the threat of climate change, like the drive to move to electric vehicles or to solar power, can have unintended effects on those groups who are also at greatest risk of modern slavery, including those in the Uyghur region. So finding solutions to this requires working in partnership with people who are directly affected by the issues at hand, with business, with civil society, with policymakers, and with researchers. And this research project is the product of such a partnership. The practical guidance that they've produced for investors, as well as the evidence-based recommendations they've created for policymakers, provide a roadmap that can help us to understand how we can move beyond the issues and into effective action that improves our responses both to modern slavery and to climate change. So with that, I am delighted to hand over to Chloe Cranston, who is Head of Thematic Advocacy Programs at Anti-Slavery International and the principal investigator on this research project. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all for the introduction. So as has been said, I am Chloe and I work for Anti-Slavery International, a UK-based anti-slavery organization. So on the behalf of the entire project team, which is by no means just myself, you see some of us here today, but not all, I'm going to give a presentation of our work, our findings, and our recommendations. Don't worry, it is a short presentation because we do want to get to the panelists and the Q&A. Could we have next slide, please? So first, to start out with, I just want to give a bit of a background context to the situation we are dealing with globally. There is no argument and no denying that we urgently need a transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy for net zero commitments and for our world's future. However, we also know that this transition must be just, and by that we mean it must respect the rights of workers and communities. However, currently a just transition is not being achieved, and this is including due to the solar and electric vehicle industries existing or increasing reliance on the Uyghur region. The solar industry in particular is uniquely heavily reliant on the region for sourcing of polysilicon and metallurgical grade silicon, the key inputs for most of the sector. And the EV sector is increasingly reliant, particularly as it relates to lithium processing. The Uyghur region is where the Chinese government is committing egregious persecution against the native Uyghur and other Turkic and Muslim majority peoples. This persecution includes many forms of abuse, including multiple systems of state-imposed forced labor, which intersect with other abuses, including mass arbitrary detention, forced sterilization of women, and forced separation of families. The UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, who we're so grateful to have here today, has concluded that the forced labor may amount to a crime against humanity, and I'll let him discuss that later. The scale of the repression and the Chinese state interest in it, however, means that due diligence per the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights on the ground is wholly impossible, and this poses unique challenges for businesses and investors, which we'll get into. And finally, it's worth flagging that the Uyghur region is an epicenter for coal-fueled electricity. And one expert analysis has concluded that all polysilicon, again, the key input for the solar industry, all polysilicon plants in the region use coal. So faced with this conflict, that our transition from fossil fuels is currently reliant on egregious state-led persecution of an entire population, we as a project team have sought to reach who we believe are the key stakeholders to shift this. Next slide, please. So we believe that investors and governments carry much of the key power to address this false choice we face between the just transition and the rights of the transition from fossil fuels and the rights of the Uyghur population. As key carriers of capital and for governments of policy direction, a coordinated and comprehensive response is critical to drive a rechanneling of investments into companies where the human rights of both workers and communities are respected. Our work has therefore had a dual focus: to produce guidance to investors on how to address Uyghur forced labor in solar and EV portfolios, and two, to outline what governments must do to incentivize and support corporate actors to make sure this shift away from the Uyghur region happens. Next slide, please. So we undertook this work between March and September last year, and the work involved reviewing current solar supply chains, which was published as an earlier publication called Overexposed, through consultations and workshops with investors and engagement with other groups, including Uyghur rights groups and experts on the UN Guiding Principles, You can read more about the methodology in the publications. So what did we find? First, we found that investors noted that engagement with companies in China is increasingly frustrating. There are limitations and restrictions in what information is shared by companies, both due to the legal restrictions in China and due to growing opaqueness of supply chains. Second, we found that investors had a limited understanding of state-imposed forced labor as opposed to privately imposed forced labor. This was affecting the approaches to risk management decisions due to an absence of understanding that in state-imposed forced labor contexts, and this I want to flag means whether we were referring to the Uyghur region or other examples like state-imposed forced labor in cotton in Turkmenistan, there's extremely limited corporate leverage to change the situation. As such, investors were largely still stuck in cautious engagement, despite the frustrating results they found. Divestment was only recognised as a last resort, and this was taken largely only in response to controversy data by ESG data providers or in response to the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, which I'm sure we will get onto. So very much linked to the above, there was clear frustration from investors with ESG data providers and with governments. On the former, we found that ESG data providers' methodology means that major human rights risks, including Uyghur forced labour, are not identified. And on governments, there is a clear silo between the E and the S in ESG-related regulation. This means that investors are incentivized to invest into green investments, rightly so, but with little to no regard for human rights. The EU taxonomy was much cited in this. Investors also noted that the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act has been the main incentive for action, and the lack of comparable regulation elsewhere limits investors' ability to exercise their leverage. Overall, many investors felt compelled to invest into the Uyghur region, despite awareness of the egregious rights violations due to perceived lack of alternatives for the solar and EV industries. Next slide, please. So our work has responded to these findings. And first, we have produced the guidance to investors, and I'll just briefly cover what it includes. You will have to read it to fully know. So first, we provided information to better understand Uyghur forced labour. So what is happening in the region? What is state-imposed forced labour? We've included a decision tree to better identify where divestment would be necessary, which really unpacks how to understand the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights when applied to Uyghur forced labour. We've included tips to conduct desk-based due diligence of supply chains and tips on how to respond to what we call red herring responses from companies when engaging with investors. For example, if a company claims it's done an audit in the region, despite the fact that we know audits cannot credibly be done in the region. We've got a chapter on ideas for collective engagement and collaboration, and we've included summarized information on the potential for ethical and sustainable alternatives. Next slide, please. However, as alluded to, we really did find that investor and corporate action will fail to drive the shift we need unless there is parallel coordinated global governmental action. We've produced a policy brief, which although focused on the UK government, is also applicable to to all governments, in which we've highlighted the need for, first, this issue to be at the top of the agenda of international forums and for international collaboration on this issue so that all markets around the world have equal access to rights-respecting green technologies. We believe that governments must introduce cross-departmental working groups which avoid a silo between climate change and human rights priorities. We believe governments, and we see that governments must introduce and use and employ domestic trade and development policies to fund and incentivize and support research into alternative sources of supply and new technologies. However, in all policy making on the shift away from the Uyghur region and what the alternatives could be, we need to see decision makers incorporate representatives of the global Uyghur community, trade unions, civil society, and indigenous peoples, so that we avoid a problem shift where the current problem we have is not just simply shifted somewhere elsewhere. Governments must introduce due diligence and trade regulation. By trade regulation, we're referring to import controls, which mandate and incentivize businesses and investors to respect human rights and to remove Uyghur forced labour from their supply chains. And finally, we need to see governments strengthen and reform sustainable finance regulation. This includes making sure there's no longer silos between the E and the S in ESG-related regulation, and also regulating ESG data providers. Final slide, please. So as I said, that was just a preview. You do have to read the publications if you want to know more. So we published 3 different outputs. The first is the investor guidance. The second is the policy brief for policymakers. And then we've also published a research summary, which includes top-line summary of the findings and recommendations across all stakeholders, which we recommend for any reader. Thank you very much. I will now pass on to my lovely co-author, Anita.
So much for that, Chloe. It's been a really wonderful collaboration with Anti-Slavery International and Sheffield Hallam University. But now we will be moving on to the panelist discussion, and I will invite the panelists that we have: Professor Tomoya Obokata, the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, who has been in that role since March 2020. Also Babur Ilchi, who is a Uyghur person and is the program manager at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. And finally, we also have Reggie Smith, a research analyst for Eventide Investment, and he's primarily responsible for evaluating and monitoring new and existing investment opportunities with a focus on clean energy. I can't see Reggie for the minute. There you are, Reggie. Great to see all of you here, and thank you for taking the time to spend with us as we really come together from different stakeholder groups to really address the issue of the human rights crisis in the Uyghur region. So thank you. Professor Obokata, I'm going to start with you. You examine forced labor all around the world. So based on your work, could you summarize what you and other UN expert bodies have identified is happening in the Uyghur region?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to begin by congratulating all of those involved in conducting this important research and also producing the important output, which I have read, and I found them very useful. As you might know, in 2022, I submitted a report to the UN Human Rights Council, which explored the exploitation of minorities in different parts of the world. And I have a couple of paragraphs on the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In order to make my assessment, I consulted a large volumes of materials, research coming from different side, not just UN bodies, but also civil society, the government of China, and other experts, and so on. And I also consulted widely with a number of stakeholders, including the survivors themselves. And based on the information I received, I personally concluded that the forced labor has been occurring in the region particularly through vocational skills education and training center system, as well as the poverty alleviation through the labor transfer. And I found that there were indicators of forced labor, which may include, but are not limited to, very severe working conditions, surveillance, restriction of movement, threats, physical and sometimes sexual violence, and other inhumane and degrading treatment. These are clearly indicators of forced labor. So I made that conclusion. And in some instances, the powers exercise control over many people are so severe that some instances may at least amount to enslavement as a crime against humanity, which is one of the gravest forms of human rights violations. And in addition to my report, a few months later, the former High Commissioner Bachelet also submitted her report. And she obviously goes in detail about different different human rights issues, but her findings on forced labor seem to be in line with my findings. So I think our findings are quite similar, if not the same, although we conducted research independently of each other. Thank you.
No, great. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate the work, or your work and the work of the UN in furthering awareness on the issue. But just drawing out further, based on your extensive experience on forced labor in other contexts, what do you believe companies need to understand about the situation in the Uyghur region specifically?
Yes, in many cases, and according to the recent estimates, I think about close to 50 million people are in modern slavery, about half of which are experiencing forced labor. Many of these instances are done in a private setting by private corporations working in farms and factories and so on. But what we need to highlight here is that the nature is different in that it is in a Uyghur situation. It's a state-sponsored where the Chinese government has been compelling Uyghur people to work, which goes beyond the exceptions recognized under international labor law. Now, there are different examples of state-sponsored forced labor, but a certain guidance is given by an instrument known as ILO Abolition of Forced Labor Convention, number 105, which was adopted in 1957. Now, it gives some examples, such as imposing forced labor as a means of political coercion or education, or as a punishment for expressing political views contrary to the state establishment, or as a method of mobilizing or using labor for the purposes of economic development, and as a means of labor discipline, and as a means of racial, national, and religious discriminations. And in applying these in the context of Xinjiang province, then yes, certainly answer seems to be there, and that also in line with what I found and what you have also found in your important research. And this is a quite important point, because unlike that forced labor promoted by just purely private companies, the involvement of state makes it extremely difficult for investors to make the decision, oh, what can we do? And so I think that is restricted. So that's why some of the recommendations made by the researchers for this report are quite important. Divestment may be an important decision to make. So I will stop there for now. That I'll be very happy to answer any other questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Professor Obokata, really, pointing out the importance of recognizing how state-imposed forced labor has to be dealt with differently, and how that there is really a system of oppression that, governs that whole situation. So with that, I'm going to really move to Babur, and thanks for being here. We have a lot of investors and corporations in the audience, Babur. Based on what Professor Obokata has also shared with us, and has explained the gravity of the situation, and of course, your own personal experience as a Uyghur fighting Uyghur rights, could you outline your perspective on what investors and companies need to do to achieve a truly just transition away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, purely speaking, the focus that Chloe was saying is more on E than S, and by recognizing that it's not an either or scenario, we shouldn't be focused on either a clean energy transition or on human rights. It's really a just climate transition or a just clean energy transition that needs to be focused on. And that includes uplifting and protecting the human rights of all people, including Uyghurs, upholding their dignity and producing clean energy at the same time is something that's possible, but is not being enacted today. By continuing to act on this false dichotomy, we're actually getting further away from our goals. Production of solar modules and other components, it's produced through coal energy. It's dirty production. It makes it harder to reach clean energy goals. And ultimately, you leave behind the most vulnerable people. Forced labor is a heinous act, and it strips people of their freedom and their safety. This shift from fossil fuels to renewables can't forget the most vulnerable, and it can't exploit it either. As it stands, this transition to solar energy is being done on the backs of Uyghurs, And as consumers and people, as investors and corporations, this transition to renewables requires that we need to fight as hard for climate justice as we fight against climate change.
Thanks so much for that, Prabhu. Really appreciate it, and all the work that you've been continuing to do in this area. And Reggie, great to have you again with us on our webinar and speaking on this really important issue. Eventide has, early on recognized the critical risks in the Uyghur region and has been very focused on implementing a responsible investing and stewardship approach to addressing and mitigating this risk in your renewable energy portfolios. How does this new guidance and research inform and update your firm's approach?
Hi, Anita, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. As a quick disclaimer, nothing I say should be taken as investment advice. This is a very important issue to us, and we've been now thinking about it and working on it for over 2 years. And I would say that this report really is a comprehensive overview of a lot of the things that we've been thinking about and have been working on. And I think the comprehensive nature of it is, in 40 or so pages is truly remarkable. Touching on how forced labor is involved in solar supply chains. And then I particularly like the practical steps for desktop research and the commentary as well, for example, on bifurcation, which is something that we've talked a lot about, where bifurcation is a situation that a lot of companies are facing today, that the industry is sort of in today, where they will have one supply chain almost completely immersed in China, using Uyghur slave labor inputs, for example, raw materials or polysilicon made in Xinjiang, and then another supply chain using polysilicon from Germany or the US, typically outside of China, that does not have any forced labor, but it's the same company operating both operations, so they've just sort of separated their supply chains. And we think that's a serious issue where even though a company can say, hey, my solar panel is not made with forced labor, they're still profiting a company that has exposure either directly or indirectly to the Uyghur atrocities. And so we certainly appreciate the report and all the details it provides in a condensed way. And I would say, a lot of the, on a sort of personal note, a lot of the feedback from investors, et cetera, hopefully gives folks a sense of camaraderie that they're, others are caring about these issues as much as they are.
Thanks so much for that, Reggie. I think, raising the issue of bifurcation, really important really important point, that you cannot just look at what's in front of you, but really have to go down the supply chain and understand that, there is that kind of addressing it across the whole company structure or supply structure, not just for the purposes of complying with a particular requirement in a country, etc. So really going to the core of eradicating Uyghur forced labor in the supply chains. I also agree that investors have really come together and been holding companies to account. The points you raise is really important for investors to be aware of those differences, to really increase their leverage and take the necessary steps to really address this issue in their portfolio. But I think all of what you raised and the camaraderie with investors, I mean, there have been challenges that you've faced in your engagements on the issue, particularly with renewable energy companies. What do you think? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there is so many challenges with renewable energy? There's so much information out there, but there continues to be that challenge. And what are your thoughts on how we can overcome those challenges?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll lay out sort of 4 challenges and then how I think we can overcome those. So one, education, and this is huge. Early on in our engagement process, we found that the C-suite in particular was not very educated on how forced labor was involved in the solar supply chain, any alternative supply, and then really, what they should do in response. And this report and other reports, the work from Laura Murphy, for example, should really help on the education side, where we like to go to our meetings sort of more knowledgeable, if you will, try to be more knowledgeable than the management teams we're talking to. So, we certainly would encourage, ourselves to really research and know the issues. And I think this investor guidance is a quick way to really get up to speed, for sure. Another issue is they would try to solve the problem, what we believe, in an inadequate way. For example, they would say, the suppliers, for example, if they're a solar panel buyer, they would say, they have told us that they don't have exposure to the Uyghur region, or we have a contractual representation that they don't have exposure to the Uyghur region. And because you can't verify that, because we can't actually get people in the Uyghur region to verify, then a lot of these promises and claims really, they could just be saying that, and there's no proof. So this is where supply chain mapping and asking for their suppliers, verification through third-party sources. For example, if it's been verified by the U.S. CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, that this particular supplier from this particular region does not have forced labor, then that should, we believe, give investors confidence that particular supplier is free of forced labor. So solving lightly is an issue. So it's sort of that second and third approach that really needs to be implemented, we believe. And then thirdly, another issue that we see is that a solar company can be buying from one supplier for one region, for example, the US, which has the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and another supplier for another region of the world where they're developing projects, let's say in India or in Europe. And so a simple question that we like to ask is, are you buying sort of UFLPA compliant modules across the board? And even if the procurement locations are different, have you applied the same rigorous approach to verification that you did for example, your US imports versus your imports in other areas of the world? So there's ways that we are thinking about this to try to bring a uniform approach coming out of the company, even if regulations are not uniform, right? Are not across the board similar. And then lastly, we think that in the US, some of the solar panels that are still coming in, even with the UFLPA, they're exposed to Uyghur forced labor, and they could be likely wafers made with polysilicon from Xinjiang that were sent to, let's say, India or Southeast Asia, and then imported from those locations into the US, so not from China directly. And so this is where, once again, the supply chain mapping, asking who your suppliers are, doing some supply chain mapping, maybe that pairing with research they've already done, and helping them come to a conclusion on what their level of risk and exposure is there. And sometimes it is very obvious, especially if you use import data. We think that you can sort of triangulate pretty clearly on those risks. So, so we try to take a collaborative approach to really come alongside companies and help the industry tackle this problem with a solution-oriented approach, but recognizing that it is severe, that this is not something to be taken lightly. And we like to describe the atrocities to our management teams. We like to describe what is happening, because at the end of the day, we're talking about real people's lives, and we think that that should not be lost here. This is much more than just supply chain talk and infrastructure talk. We're talking about real people's lives, and we are not going to sacrifice human life for the implementation of renewable energy. And so we want to see a complete transformation of the supply chain that is reputable and good for everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much, Reggie. Really important to bring out again the humanity here in the issues we are talking about. We do use terms like supply chain, human capital management, and really we're talking about the dignity, fundamental rights of people, of workers, and that's really important. So thank you for raising that. And I think you also talked very importantly about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the importance of sort of regulation in driving this. And so I wanted to come back to Babur, and in all the collective work that we've been doing together with Uyghur Human Rights Project and other Uyghur groups as well. We've recognized the need, the importance for government actors to enable a swift diversification away from the Uyghur region. Could you outline what your asks are of governments to ensure that we don't face this false choice between climate change goals and human rights goals, as was outlined earlier, as Reggie and Professor Bukata as well spoke to?
Yeah, I think what's happening now is, as has been said a lot this panel, the recognition of state-imposed forced labor is not up to date, or it has fallen behind. And other areas that current legislation that exists is not up to the task for this. So what governments need to do is adopt UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act style legislation that specifically targets the Uyghur region or state-imposed forced labor for goods that are either made there or with components or materials that are produced from there, or from Uyghur forced labor from labor transfers that may occur outside of the Uyghur region as well. These are all really important things in order to incentivize companies to move out from the Uyghur region and stop using state-imposed forced labor. And we see that there is an effect, because in Overexposed, the report by Sheffield Hallam University, we've seen that since the initial report on solar module manufacturing, the production of polysilicon went down from 45% to 35% in terms of world production capability. And we're also seeing that solar firms are beginning to bifurcate their supply chain, which to me says that there is the ability to shift away from using state-imposed forced labor supply chains. And what needs to be done is better incentivizing it, or outright prohibiting the use of state-imposed forced labor or Uyghur forced labor in these supply chains, to ensure that human rights are not forgotten when it comes to the energy transition that is coming.
No, thanks so much, Barbara. Really well said. Really appreciate that call out, the need, both you and Reggie, the call out that we really need that global standard, that single standard to hold all businesses to account, to respect those rights. We also just wanted to highlight that, Babur, for example, highlighted, as Chloe did, a report by Sheffield Hallam University called Overexposed, which is really part of, which precedes these reports, but very much part of it. We do provide links to those reports in the slide deck that we will make available to everyone today. So rest assured that the resources referred to, we will provide that information later on. But I wanted to I see there's lots of questions from the audience for our panelists and for the other speakers today. So I really would invite Victoria and Caroline to also join our panel today to answer to really address the questions that are coming in from the audience. And I'm going to hand off to one of our co-authors and researchers, the wonderful Edie Martin. Edie, it'll be great for you to help us through these questions. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everyone. And thank you for such insightful comments from the panelists. So yeah, we've had quite a few questions coming in already, and I feel like a few are within themes. So maybe we'll go first to Reggie to talk through some of his kind of engagement questions that you've brought up around kind of supply chain due diligence and how to deal with the opacity of the Chinese government supply chains. There's questions about kind of how to go beyond tier 2 or 3 supply chain mapping. I don't know if you've got any more insights you'd like to provide on that. You've said quite a lot already.
So we really appreciate the work from Laura Murphy, especially that supply chain mapping. And then we would suggest that asking the company for more information is a good approach as well. I don't think I have much beyond that. Import data as well. That would sort of be the fourth piece there. So the reports, or the 3 pieces: the reports, the import data, and then asking the company. At some point, we know you might have to make an assumption, but location is a key indicator here. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you. We've also received quite a few questions about regulation as a tool for mitigating these challenges. And I wondered if, Babur, you wanted to comment, you've mentioned the UFLPA, about how legislation can protect people and also how it ends up kind of putting other countries who don't have such strong legislation kind of in the firing line of becoming a dumping ground. I wonder if you had any more comments on if you can see the comments on legislation and regulation, how they can help.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can try to answer that. Essentially, because of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act being so strong, we've seen this bifurcation in supply chains, which is leading to other countries, Canada, the EU, other nations, becoming dumping grounds for Uyghur forced labor goods. This is unfair in 2 ways. One, consumers in that region don't necessarily know what they're receiving. And by continuing to allow the exploitation of Uyghur people, we are enabling the crimes against humanity and the ongoing repression and oppression of the Uyghur people, of my people, through mass-scale state-imposed forced labor, as well as several other mechanisms of destruction of identity, erasure, and assimilation that are happening to the Uyghur people today. By creating unified one standard legislation across the world, we're effectively preventing a key part of the concerted efforts to destroy or assimilate and control the Uyghur people. We're preventing that from continuing to occur, and for the Chinese government to continue profiting from it.
Thank you so much. Yeah. A question to all the panel. We have someone here from Fashion Revolution talking about how they can kind of bring this research into working with fashion brands. And so kind of this is a general question about how do you push companies to kind of support the findings recommendations? What have you found helpful? This is to all the panelists. If you found any tools work for sort of making companies address these issues within their supply chains. That includes Anita and Chloe, if you want to jump in.
I could answer the second part of Chiara's question, which was, do you see a role for fashion retailers in advocating for your government policy recommendations? Definitely, yes. So I think just to go back to one of the cruxes we saw with the fact that the solar, particularly the solar, but increasingly the EV sectors are so reliant on the Uyghur region, and the Uyghur region is so dominant in our global supply chains. To have a shift on that, we really do need kind of every stakeholder, and sorry if that's NGO speak. So we do need every type of actor involved. So investors and corporates play a huge role in their own due diligence, their own disengagement decisions, their own divestment decisions. But we also need to see policy and regulatory action by governments. And that includes the role of, for example, financial incentives, funding, and other work to help make sure that alternative markets are growing and offering the alternatives to the solar industry. And that's a demand that investors should be making of governments and companies from any single industry, not just solar and EV. Fashion industry and other industries are increasingly using solar panels, for example, so they can equally make those demands of governments.
And I can just add, one of the things that we've sought in our engagement process is really to start to see action in a phased approach. We understand that procurement is a very critical, function for any business. And one of the things that we've saw it is the shift, the purchasing power. And I think this sort of framework is true, whether it's on the EV side or the solar side, shift the purchasing power to better and better suppliers, better and better actors to incentivize them to continue to progress. For example, if they're bifurcated, to become less and less and eventually zero bifurcated, or if they're in the Uyghur region, to completely exit that region. So a phased approach was something that we thought might be constructive for companies to think about.
Perfect, thank you. We've also received a question from Jens Holm from the European Solar Manufacturing Council, which is about the EU regulation to ban forced labour products, and if that will solve some of the issues we're talking about in terms of bifurcation. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that regulation and its potential.
That's probably one for me. So for context, Anti-Slavery International works very heavily on advocacy around that regulation, and we're really pleased to see it coming. It could potentially address the dumping ground bifurcation issues we've been discussing. However, and apologies if this is a very British phrase, I don't know, proof is in the pudding on this one. It really much depends how it is designed. So we are not yet at the final stage of debate. We're about to hopefully reach that. And it really much depends on whether they make that regulation. So whether they, being the Council, the European Council, the European Commission and the Parliament, whether they decide to make it strong enough to address state-imposed forced labour. So the Parliament's proposal does have much of what we want to see in it. However, what we really need to see to make in the final negotiation is what's been referred to as the reversal of the burden of proof, or the rebuttable presumption that you have in the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. We need to see that applied to be able to be applied to situations of state-imposed forced labour. We do not know yet if that will happen, and it does need to, so that is effective, not just on Uyghur forced labour, but again, we have to understand that state-imposed forced labour happens elsewhere, for example, cotton on Turkmenistan. So that law is really an opportunity to address forced labour globally that we really hope the EU will not miss.
Thank you, Chloe. And we've received an interesting question here, which is about addressing the kind of question of divestment, which comes up a lot through our guidance. So the question is, could businesses, including suppliers and investors, exert leverage so as to improve the working conditions in this region, as opposed to exiting or divesting? There's a similar question above, which I'll just group together. Do you think an alliance power between companies could be possible and create a counterpower? So that kind of question goes to everyone in terms of, do you think leverage kind of functions well in this context, or do you think there are alternative strategies needed?
Just going to ask Professor Obokata whether he could make some comments on that, because you also called out the importance of, financial institutions, the option of divestment versus, exerting leverage. Because, we do want to exert leverage to alleviate the situation, but because of state-imposed labor, divestment is an option. So, in the context of what Edie was mentioning, maybe you could share your views on that as well.
Yes, I mean, under normal not normal, but if you're talking about the private businesses, and yes, I mean, I do encourage all investors to work with respective businesses to change their behavior. I think that's a important first step, and the divestment should always be the last step result, because there could be some implications in terms of, okay, if you pull out the investment, then okay, the business may suffer, but what would be the impact of that on the workers themselves? So I am also looking from that angle. Then divestment, and I think, I mean, if the state, as you say, state-imposed forced labor would make it quite difficult to go through the whole process, I think. So then the older investors and so on might naturally consider, okay, we, because there's nothing else that they can, that can be done, then so we'll go through that. But I do also hope that the investment community do think about the potential consequences and see what they can also do to alleviate. But the most important thing is that the rights of workers are protected. And I don't think there's any right or wrong answer in this, and it all depends and on the context and solve all. But I do, I'm not an investment specialist, so maybe other panelists may be able to comment further on that. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for those comments, and maybe I can layer on it, but also invite my other speakers here to jump in. And I think that the issue of divestment becomes a really unfortunate but necessary option in this context of state-imposed forced labor, where you have operations in a region that is under that kind of state oppression. There is really no leverage that you can, no effective leverage that you have to make a change, whether it's investors or companies. Continue action and this sort of combined stakeholder pressure, government levels that can help to make that change, but very sort of immediately in the short term, in the medium term, in fact, you have little to no leverage. There's no ability to as well remediate the harms that is ongoing. And if you can't do that, then really what is the option? So if there is an investment that is really operating in the Uyghur region, I think the options are pretty limited, and divestment is a very serious consideration. Where there are operations outside of the region in other countries or other parts of China, but reliant on Uyghur forced labor in the region, there are some actions that we ask investors and companies to undertake and to use their leverage to really move away from those relationships, to terminate those relationships and find alternative relationships. And when that can be done in really an expedited way, because this issue has been around for a long time, then that could be an option. But responsible investment and responsible divestment is very much part of this conversation. But I'll throw it open to any others who want to comment, although I know, Edie, there are other questions as well. Thanks.
But maybe just give a shout out to our guidance, because we actually have a chapter that really breaks that down kind of bullet point by bullet point, particularly applying the UN guiding principles and being very clear why, when you look at the UN guiding principles, this does lead to divestment being a necessary approach. And also this question of unintended consequences and what the view of the Uyghur community is on that. So another plug to read the publications.
I'll give another plug to the to the guidance with another question, which is on alternatives, which is something we discuss at quite significant length in the guidance. But Babu, this question is for you, and I'm not sure that you'll be able to answer, so feel free to pass on to someone else. But this is a question about other alternatives that are out there that have considered for supporting green energy, or if not, the importance of alternatives in your from your perspective.
Yeah, maybe I need to clarify what I said. What I mean is that by producing solar modules or components for electric vehicles in the Uyghur region, in my homeland, with Uyghur forced labor, we're actually producing clean energy modules or components in a dirty way through the predominant use of coal electricity and the reduced safety and environmental standards in the region, which are poisoning the waterways, the lands, and creating inhospitable and downright dangerous working conditions and living conditions for Uyghur people. So what I mean by moving away from the Uyghur region isn't moving away from clean energy. It's more so moving to a system that benefits all people instead of exploiting them for the purpose of other nations or other governments.
Thank you for that. That's really useful. Thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to make any further comments on the importance of alternatives or their kind of the lack thereof and the difficulties within that. Reggie, I don't know if that's something that's come up within your work in investment in this issue.
Yeah, the way we've thought about that is particularly for large developers here in the US, they would be able really we think have the most leverage to supplying the capital or the long-term offtake in terms of supply agreements to incentivize new supply chain opportunities, across the board, whether it be at the module, cell, or wafering step in particular. Of course, there's legislation like the IRA, which is to incent that. And then from an investor perspective, and depending on, you know, how different funds are set up, for example, investors can also think about investing directly in reputable solar companies at the startup stage or that are more mature. So we believe that this is an important part of addressing this issue, and it will just depend on you know, what approach someone wants to take. We believe that engaging companies to help set up that reputable supply chain is maybe the fastest way to do that.
Hey, Edie, I was going to just kind of jump in here because I was also kind of conscious of the time as we're kind of getting towards the 11 o'clock hour, the end of the hour. I did notice a question here that talked about red flags for investors in identifying companies at risk of human rights abuses, and in this context, Uyghur forced labor. And I also wanted to say that within the different reports, particularly the investor guidance, we do talk very specifically about red flags. We provide a decision tree, which Chloe as well referred to in her presentation, in terms of what decisions you make when you identify those red flags. So really encourage you to look at the take a look at the guidance, you know, have a look at the different sections. We've provided the sections that, you know, can really operate on their own, so you can hone in on what you need depending on your level of awareness of the issues. And also in that context, as part of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, we operate, or we coordinate a working group of investors who come together on a quarterly basis to talk about the issues, to really share information, to exchange and learn from civil society and human rights experts, Uyghur experts and the Uyghur people, on what is going on and how that really needs to inform investment stewardship and potentially divestment decisions as well. So really happy for you to join that working group. I will provide some contact details later. We also have an engagement group that are engaging with a number of companies. And whilst we understand that, you know, leverage is limited, we do come together as a collective action platform with investors, informed by civil society organizations, to really put pressure on companies. And we have heard from solar companies that they are looking at this issue seriously because of a lot of pressure from the investors in asking those questions. But really also, so really wanting to call that out and invite investors to read the report, to get involved in the work as well with the Investor Alliance or other organizations. But and in that context, really thanking investors for joining us today, urging investors as well to assess their portfolios and their approaches to investing in green energies. Also wanted to thank representatives of multiple governments for joining today. We repeat our urge for global collaboration on this issue to enable a truly just transition. And we're happy to continue the conversation with policymakers and governments. So please feel free to contact myself or Chloe. Again, we will share our contact details if you want to discuss or discuss any of the recommendations further. So with that, I actually wanted to thank all the panelists, but also give the opportunity to any of the panelists, you know, our great grantor or donor of the sponsor of this project, the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Center, as well, call out for really enabling us to do that work. But any last comments from anyone as we have the last 60 seconds before we close off?
No, just thank you, Anita.
Yeah, great. Well, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm amazed that we managed to do this on time with as many speakers as we have. Please do feel free to reach out to us, and we will share the recording, the slide decks, and contact details after this. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to all the researchers and our sponsors. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anita.
Thank you.